All right. Thanks for sticking it out so long. Today I'll talk about language, and in particular large language models, which for some foreshadowing I'll note in advance are not in fact synonymous terms. LLMs, if you haven't heard, are pretty cool. They take words, transform these words into token vectors, learn hierarchical relationships between these token vectors, and eventually distill these vectors into a trajectory that points to the next most probable token in a sequence. Do this millions of times and you get the basic algorithm of LLMs like GPT. Do this trillions of times and you get cool emergent phenomena. Among these phenomena, it turns out, is some half-decent poetry and existential banter. But more relevant to today's talk is the surprising finding that LLM embeddings computed from image captions can predict image-evoked high-level visual brain activity as accurately as the features of machine vision models computed from the images themselves. If you're anything like me, the first thing you might be thinking is, wait, that's kind of weird. LLMs don't actually see anything at all. How could they possibly predict how the brain responds to the things that I see? The second thing you might be thinking is, well, show me the data. And in service of doing exactly that while strategically gesturing at this fancy method slide you can ask me about later, here it is. Each point in this plot is a model, either a pure vision or a pure language model. And by pure, I basically mean self-supervised. No semantic pollution from explicit category labels, no human-in-the-loop reinforcement learning. On the y-axis of this plot is the average brain predictivity score. The dotted line at the top of the plot is the noise ceiling, and the semi-translucent rectangles that extend across the individual points are the means of the model set. Looking at this, the primary takeaway is that, although they are not exactly matched, language models are exceptional predictors of image-evoked high-level visual activity in human brains, despite never seeing images. So why do we care? Well, one good reason might be this. The resurrection of the once zeitgeisty idea that human vision is somehow language aligned. This idea has taken many different forms over the years, but perhaps the most well-known is likely to be some form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, aka the Russian blues, aka language shapes perception, though this is more about behavior. On the brain side of things, you might also have seen some of these recent works, methodologically diverse, but all unified in the search for some form of answer to the question of whether language learning has somehow informed, reshaped, or realigned the visual representations of our brains. And at first glance, our results here might seem to support some version of this idea. But what exactly does language alignment mean? Is the language alignment in language alignment the language we speak, language with a capital L, language that shows displacement, discreteness, duality, arbitrariness, productivity, cultural transmission, and recursion? Or is something simpler going on? In previous work, we attempted to break down what it was that language models were predicting in visual cortex by breaking them down into simpler parts. In doing so, we found, for example, that all of the visual brain variants explained by language models could be reduced to a basis set of simple nouns in no syntactic order, and mimicked by minimal custom word models that we hacked together using a variant of anchor point embedding analysis. Taken together, we called this breakdown the OpenAI razor. That is, never attribute to meaningful psychological latents what can just as meaningfully be attributed to simple interpolation on high-dimensional manifolds. This brings us then to the monkey razor, a logical test wherein we can confidently say that any trends relating to language models that we observe in both human brains and in monkey brains cannot meaningfully be attributed to language as we, humans, speak it. All we need to do to test this razor is run the same model comparisons in monkeys that we run in humans. And thanks to our friends at the Harvard Medical School, we were able to do exactly this with neural recordings from the inferotemporal cortex of 5 rhesus macaques showing the exact same 1,000 images that the humans saw. So here again is the data. First, we have the results I showed you before, comparing vision and language models in prediction of human high-level visual cortex. And now, here's the performance of the vision models in macaque high-level visual cortex. As expected, pretty good. But this is image-evoked visual activity after all. Also, it turns out, is pretty darn good, are the language models themselves. Even more notable, perhaps, is the interspecies rank order correlation that suggests better language models of human visual cortex tend also to be better language models of macaque visual cortex. Overall, then, the pattern of results across our unimodal vision and language models and across species looks remarkably comparable. But you might have noticed this. Even though the language models are doing well in predicting monkey vision, they're not doing quite as well as they were in predicting human vision. Is this difference of differences something that might be attributable to language? To answer this, we performed a somewhat convoluted, but ultimately informative, 3-way variance partitioning analysis, in which we first used one species brain to predict the other species brains, and then added different combinations of model features to explain the variance not shared between the species. When we did this, the main takeaway from this analysis was that after subtracting out all the variance shared in some ways with monkeys, the remaining variance in humans' brains seems just as attributable to vision models as it does to language models. And while this doesn't necessarily give us any details about the difference between the species, which may also be a function of differences in recording modality, pre-processing, et cetera, it does at least tell us that this difference isn't skewed towards language. Okay, so taken together, our monkey language vision razor here makes a decently strong case that partly because language models are pretty good models of macaque visual cortex, it likely means that language model prediction of human visual cortex has almost nothing to do with language per se. This result adds to a growing body of evidence that vision and language, at least language as learned by LLMs, are in many ways already aligned, even in the absence of explicit cross-modal learning. And in this more local case, I think the main takeaway is this. Current AI models are primarily statistical learners, and the statistics of their input, both visual and linguistic, will always be governed by the somewhat unavoidable reality that we take pictures of the things that we talk about and talk about the things that we take pictures of. High-level ventral vision only seems language-aligned to the extent that language already reflects the statistical structure of the visual world as defined in our big data sets. And with that, I'll say thank you and see you at the posters.